Hey, Nick, how's it going?
It's going great, Mike. How about yourself?
Never better. Hey, man, have you heard the news?
That depends on what news you were talking about.
It's some exciting news in the world of MongoDB World. MongoDB World is now MongoDB.live. Some exciting changes taking place there. And want to let the listeners know that the following podcast has been recorded prior to these changes taking place. So I want to let folks know that MongoDB World is now a completely free, a completely digital 2-day event that features all the great content that we were talking about before. Just want folks to know that it's now completely free and completely digital. So to get more information on that, head on over to mongodb.live or mongodb.com/world. Hello and welcome to the MongoDB podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about data, about software development, and everything related to MongoDB. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about GraphQL with our good friend and colleague, Joe Karlsson, who is also a developer advocate at MongoDB. If you've heard of GraphQL and maybe you haven't used it for a project, this podcast is going to be for you. We're going to cover some of the foundational information about what GraphQL is, why you might want to use it, and really why you want to use it in conjunction with MongoDB. We've got some really exciting stuff that we're talking about on this podcast around GraphQL and MongoDB. And I'm joined today, as usual, with my co-host, Nick Raboy. Hey, Nick, how are you?
I'm doing good over here.
Awesome. Great to have you on the show again. Just a quick reminder, MongoDB World is coming up and you can get a 25% discount off of your passes. It's the most exciting MongoDB user conference ever. We're bringing back Builders Fest and we'll have more sessions and tutorials that'll be definitely interesting for software developers and folks using MongoDB. This is not to be missed. Use code PODCAST at registration to receive 25% off. One more shout out. MongoDB is a part of the GitHub Student Developer Pack now. So if you are a student, maybe you're already in the GitHub Student Developer Pack program. If you're not, you can run on over to education.github.com, or even better yet, you can find out about the benefits of MongoDB in the GitHub Student Developer Pack by visiting www.mongodb.com/students. There's all sorts of benefits like access to MongoDB Atlas, access to University to learn about MongoDB, and much more. Stay tuned for that. For now, let's get into the podcast and talk to Joe Karlsson. All right. Hey, Joe, how are you? It's great to have you on the podcast. I wonder if you could help us out and tell us a little bit about who Joe Karlsson is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to say, Nick and Michael, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is awesome. I've been listening to podcasts forever, and I get to be on one finally. That's pretty cool.
It's great to have you. It's really phenomenal to have you. I love the work that you're doing on social media all over the place, especially lately on TikTok. It's just amazing to watch what you put together.
Yeah, they're really funny.
I feel so stupid telling people about TikTok, especially software engineers. There's not many of us on the platform yet, but I feel like it's like Wild West days out there. It's wild. Yeah, but I still feel so silly telling people I make videos on TikTok.
Well, I watched them through the other social media networks that you cross post them to. I would probably never listen to them on TikTok, but they pop up on my Twitter feed, and I think they're pretty funny.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, they work great everywhere. They're just like fun to make. And anyway, yeah. So I'm been making a ton of video content. Maybe I should talk about who I am first, like super fast.
Absolutely, yeah. Who is Joe Karlsson?
Yeah, so I'm a developer advocate. I work for MongoDB. I'm a software engineer. I'm currently based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my primary programming languages are Node and JavaScript right now. But especially in like the DevRel world, I'm always learning new stuff. So that's where I'm at right now.
Fantastic. And how long have you been at MongoDB?
It's coming up on a year, probably in like a month or two. I lose track, but it's been great. I love it so far.
That's awesome. Well, we're really glad to have you on the podcast. And we are going to focus today on something that you're very familiar with. I am not so much. We're going to focus on GraphQL. We're going to talk about what GraphQL is, why somebody would want to use it, what the benefits are, and hopefully you'll enlighten me a little bit more on GraphQL so I can begin using it. So what is your experience with GraphQL?
Yeah, so I've used it at my previous job. I was working at a large e-commerce company. I won't say what it was, but we use it on the back end. And I've been teaching and using it for probably about 3 years now. And yeah, I think it's great. And now, obviously, I think it's starting to gain some major traction across all programming languages and platforms. And it's kind of an exciting time for it.
So when you were working at this e-commerce giant that you just mentioned, did it start off as using GraphQL, or did you help kind of migrate to that from another solution?
Yeah, so we were using traditional REST endpoints and then kind of converting it over. So I was able to see some of the pain points where we're at with REST, and then also the problems that it solved as we moved this to GraphQL.
So tell us about those problems. So we're kind of painting the picture of why somebody would want to use GraphQL,
Yeah.
and I hear a lot about the comparisons between RESTful APIs and GraphQL. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's define a couple terms right at the top. So RESTful APIs, if you don't know, it stands for representational state transfer. And it's kind of our way of faking like states and through APIs. And you've probably seen it like in the URLs, it's like /users/edit/one, right? So you're like editing user one. That's the API endpoint for that.
Mm-hmm.
And we have get, post, puts, and deletes for all those for kind of doing different CRUD operations. And GraphQL is similar in many ways, but has some huge differences. So I kind of want to paint for you and Nick some of the challenges we ran into and what that solves. So I want you to imagine with me the situation. So
Take us on an adventure.
On a journey. Here we go.
Yep, there you go. And tell me if you've ever run into the situation before. So you're working on an app, and you're a front-end engineer. Maybe you're working on the app. You have some data you're showing on the screen for the users. Awesome. And then your project manager comes to you and says, "Hey, we actually need to make some different changes to that." So, for example, if I was making an e-commerce store, let's say I have a list of recent orders that a user made. Okay, cool. So I hit an endpoint. That API endpoint gives me like an array of just like order ID numbers. It doesn't give me anything specific, but my PM says, "Hey, now we actually want to show like more information than just a list of numbers because users don't think that's very useful." Have you guys ever experienced a situation where like there's a change in requirements on the front end, or like you have to get some new data from an API that you didn't have before?
Absolutely.
All
Sure.
the time.
Yeah, I feel, and that's a super common, especially with like huge applications or ones that have been around for a long time. I always tell people that the only constant in software is change, right? We're building things, they're
Mhm.
constantly changing, including the front end.
Mm-hmm.
But so traditionally with a REST API, what you would do is you'd have to go to the backend team and you have to explain to them your new requirements. And they'd probably do one of many things. They'd either create a brand new endpoint for you for this information. They can't change that existing endpoint because there's already other APIs getting that data.
Depending on it. Yeah.
They need that in that format, so they can't change it. Okay, so let's say they make a brand new endpoint for you. Then there's even more questions of how do you do that? Do they add a query string to the end of the original API, or do you add like an option in the header, or do you make a brand new endpoint that doesn't depend on it? Right? Like there's no set way of making that change.
Mm-hmm.
GraphQL fixes that problem. So instead, how GraphQL works is you have a single endpoint and you just request the data you want in the format you want from the endpoint, and it gives it back to you. So you decide the changes as the person requesting the data. I just want the data. Great. You start asking for it, gets it back to you. And that format you're getting it from never changes. So I'm hitting that one endpoint the same way every single time.
And is that because of the format of the query and the flexible nature of this query language that GraphQL speaks?
Exactly. I'm going to oversimplify it here, but you're basically sending like a JSON docket back to it in the structure that you want it. So like I want to get the order number, the product title, and the order date. And it gives it back to you in the format you send it, which is awesome.
That's awesome. So you just like a watershed moment for me. I think I now understand the difference between REST and GraphQL. One frustrating point for me as I'm trying to learn GraphQL, why not use JSON for the query? Why not? It looks like JSON, except we're missing some colons between the fields and the query strings. Why not use JSON?
You totally could. You totally could. And I've like accidentally invented GraphQL a couple times, like pre-GraphQL days, doing that same thing. And it was a huge pain. So this is actually the weird thing. GraphQL, there's a lot of misconceptions of what it is. People think it's either like, it sounds like a database because like a graph database, which it's not. And it's not really a technology. It's more like a specification. So GraphQL is a specification made that defines how this single endpoint works. So it's like, no matter where you go, it works the same way. No matter what company or language or tool set or whatever. That's why it's like been widely, every major programming language now supports GraphQL. That's because it's just the specification that kind of outlines how to build it. But you totally could, but you would lose out some of the extra like unifying features of it.
So I actually have a question. This is going back to the RESTful stuff.
Yeah.
And it may be silly, so stop me if I'm going down a rabbit hole that maybe we shouldn't focus on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you said if you have to change the API endpoints, right?
Yep.
You can't necessarily do that. You have to create a new endpoint.
Yep.
Why? Because if you have an application consuming from those endpoints and you just need to add data, is that a circumstance where that'd be all right? Maybe it's around changing or removing data.
You bring up an excellent point, but let's talk through that more. So we're having an array of data. We just want to change it up a little bit. So if you could hypothetically send that data over without really disrupting the structure of that original request, so like basically it would be backwards compatible with the old data. There is a downside of that, and the downside of that is that those endpoints digesting that data they don't need, that's too much data. So you're adding additional bandwidth over the wire, which slows down data transfer.
Got it.
So you're going to slow down your application doing that. And one of the benefits of GraphQL is that you're requesting only the data you need, nothing more and nothing less, which is better because the less data you can ask for, the quicker that's going to get to the client, the faster experience it's going to be for everybody.
Got it. Makes sense.
But there's a downside. You're paying a cost.
So will GraphQL completely take over where developers used REST in the past?
That is an excellent question. And I get asked that all the time too, like, is REST dead? Is it gone? And like, it's not. REST is going to be around. It's great. It's super helpful. We've been using it forever. It's not going anywhere. And actually, as we were migrating it, we had both, which wasn't a problem. We were slowly migrating our endpoints to the single endpoint, and we still had our existing REST endpoints up as well. So we had both. And I think we'll probably continue to have both in the future, which isn't a problem. So GraphQL is great and awesome. And I've used it on massive projects. I've used it on personal projects. But I think there's still, like, REST still works great for small projects. Frankly, it's less abstraction. It's easier to kind of just set up. You just have some data. You set up a server endpoint. You just kind of serve it up. It's a little bit less abstraction going on at a server level without GraphQL. And you don't have to worry about schemas and validations and all this other stuff on it too. Will it totally replace it? I don't think so. Not anytime soon anyways. We'll have both. But we are, trending-wise, it's massively gaining adoption.
So then what are the design considerations or the differences between developing that REST API versus that GraphQL API? Are they very different?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's a lot of patterns you follow in REST. A lot of REST is designing how that URL works, or like how the endpoint, those different endpoints work, right? Like I gave the example of like user/edit/user ID number, right? And like so how that data, like the structure that gets sent over is kind of secondary. But some things like with GraphQL, it doesn't really matter. All you're saying is, like, if you're designing a GraphQL endpoint, you're just saying what's available on there, and people can digest it however they want. They can take and choose whatever they want. Something that's actually weird that is kind of hurts people's brains a little bit with REST is that depreciating endpoints is considered an anti-pattern in GraphQL. So like, you know how like if you ever used an API, like a RESTful API that has like, you get an email after setting it up, it's like, oh, we're actually depreciating this. You're going to have to change over to version 3 of our API. That doesn't exist anymore.
And that has like a version 3 kind of part in the URL slug, right?
Yeah, exactly. For like a REST endpoint. But with GraphQL, you keep up all that old data, and you just are constantly live updating new data on that new endpoint. You can depreciate it and do that, but it's kind of a code smell. You kind of keep it up, and like you would if there's security reasons or whatever, but you always have a live single version, and it's kind of that DevOps-y continuous integration kind of philosophy for building an endpoint. It's just always being improved, always changing, always backwards compatible moving forward.
So let's say we wanted to get MongoDB into the mix for developing an API.
Yeah.
What would go into it for developing a GraphQL API using MongoDB?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So not many people may know this, but MongoDB actually unveiled the GraphQL endpoint that sits on top of the MongoDB database, which is incredible. I'm actually like super psyched as a like front end developer. This is like a major game changer. It is super easy. I want to talk a little bit about how I used to do it versus how easy it is now to do it. So before, if I wanted to set up a GraphQL endpoint using MongoDB, I had to set up my own node server, usually using Express. I download the Express GraphQL package. I had to set up all the database locally. And then you have to configure all the resolvers and like all the schema you have to use to design that endpoint. You have to set that all from scratch. With this new version with MongoDB, you literally click a button, it generates your schema for you, and it's done. It's incredible. And the reason it can do that is because MongoDB databases have a structured schema, right? So you have like when you're defining your schema, you tell it's a string or an int or a Boolean or a date. And using that information, we can generate a GraphQL schema for you automatically, which is it's so easy. It's so easy. And all the CRUD endpoints, so updating, deleting, creating, all of it just for free. Just it's literally a button and it makes it all for you.
Hold up. I got to raise my hand here. So I've always been taught MongoDB is a schemaless or schema on read database. Tell me how that contrasts with what you just said, that GraphQL and MongoDB work well together because MongoDB has a schema. Tell me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. And I love how you said schemas. That's a total like misconception. We're flexible schema. You can validate the schema, right? And the cool part too is when you generate your schema, let's say you have like a collection with a bunch of different documents in it. Your documents have a bunch of different shapes in it. You can make a subquery on it, and you could find like a subsection of those documents that you want to make a schema for. So you can define it or change it or override it or change, like do whatever you want. Or like we're gonna be making some updates later. I can add new endpoints later on.
So you're telling me that I've got this database in MongoDB, and by default, we have the shapes of our documents create the schema. So we've defined the schema literally with the data that we put into the database. And this new offering from MongoDB sounds pretty exciting to me. I can then leverage GraphQL over and above my database, and somewhere there's a button that I can click to automatically generate that GraphQL schema.
Yes.
Where is that? As a new developer, somebody that's not familiar with the offerings that MongoDB has, how do I get into this? How do I get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's part of Stitch, which is like our serverless option that sits on top of MongoDB on Atlas. But you just would, because your data is already there, maybe you have an old database or whatever, you can just hook up the serverless layer on top of it and then enable GraphQL for that. So if you're interested, I think it's actually, if you go in there like now, if you sign into your Stitch, it'll like give you a cool big announcement about how to set up your GraphQL endpoint.
That's awesome. So, and what you're talking about is MongoDB Atlas. For those of you that out there that are not familiar, Atlas, MongoDB Atlas is our database as a service. So it's at cloud.mongodb.com. And built into Atlas, as Joe is mentioning, is our backend as a service. It's Stitch. Think of it like serverless for your MongoDB databases. So you can write functions and they live in the cloud. And now we've added on this great new feature around GraphQL. That's pretty exciting. And that's still in beta, right?
I'm not sure. Actually, Nick, I think it's in general release, I think now, but it may still be a beta features.
Yeah, I think it's beta right now. By the time this episode releases, it may be general release by then. But we'll definitely have to keep it posted, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I tell you too about actually my favorite part about GraphQL that we haven't even touched on
Do
yet?
it.
Okay. So it is called graphical. I've heard people call it graphical. Or like people don't want to say it. It sounds graphical, right? It's like a graphical user interface. It's kind of like a graphical joke. Get it? Developers terrible at jokes. That's a great name though. But graphical is actually my favorite feature about GraphQL. And it's a GUI that allows anyone to view and play with your endpoints at any time. Think of it also as like a always up-to-date documentation of all the data and all the operations available on your data. So why is this helpful? Again, follow me on this adventure. Imagine you're on a large team working on a single project, and you are this developer needing to make a change in this front end, like how we talked about earlier. The hard part is tracking down the right team. So there's tons of different API teams maintaining all this data. Who do you talk to about it? And then each of these teams also documents their data differently. Some of them use Swagger. Some of them are using an out-of-date README file. Some of them are using nothing. It's all over the place, ununified. Graphical takes all those endpoints and keeps all that documentation up to date because it just shows you like all the schema and all the operations for everything. So it's always up to date and it always shows you how it works. And it's always the same no matter what team is maintaining the endpoint, which is incredible. It's a total game changer. So like makes working with other teams super easier. I'm not saying it like stops total collaboration on teams, right? Like we still have to like talk to the other people, but it makes finding and getting that data and making sure it's consistent and up to date super easy.
So I have a question more specifically probably around Stitch and graphical.
Yeah.
And this is, I have a very loose kind of understanding of this, and maybe you have a better understanding. So when you're say a TypeScript developer, you're dealing with type definitions. I think I heard somewhere that a lot of implementations of GraphQL, you can automatically generate your interfaces. Is this something that we can do with Stitch's implementation, or maybe you haven't tried it yet?
You're talking about like Stitch and TypeScript specifically?
No, with I'm sorry, with GraphQL. So MongoDB's implementation of GraphQL. Can you consume the schemas from the endpoint and kind of build those TypeScript definitions automatically, or maybe that information hasn't come back?
I'm not sure. I've never done that personally. That might be possible. I'm not sure if I don't think there's a connector out there yet. So I don't know, to be honest. I'm not sure.
No worries. I could be asking it wrong too.
I'm not sure how similar those implementations are too. I've actually never used TypeScript before, which is kind of bad.
Oh, all right.
I've used Flow actually quite a bit,
Sure.
but yeah, TypeScript I haven't used too much. But like if you're going to find those endpoints though, it should be pretty easy to port them over or whatever you're using, I guess.
Great. So we've got this great new release, and folks are going to be excited to jump in there. What should people know about using just native GraphQL, accessing MongoDB versus using the GraphQL features built into Stitch? Is there any major differences or shortcomings, perhaps?
Not yet. So obviously GraphQL works really well with our MongoDB database, and GraphQL is just it's a specification, so it's not database dependent. But you can do things with like Stitch, like you can pull in data from multiple collections. But doing complex queries, like for example with the MongoDB aggregation pipeline, those are a little bit harder to do. You can define some custom queries on your server, not a problem. Yeah, so like out of the box, MongoDB is able to generate a schema for you, which is awesome. But you can make any changes you want to that later on. It sets up all the basic CRUD operations, but any extra stuff you have to too. And something I haven't actually tried yet is hooking it up to other services too. So like I think you could go like have your serverless option, go make another like API query and go pull it. You could like define more complex GraphQL queries hitting other services besides just MongoDB. By making like API requests basically out to go get that data for you.
So inbound and outbound.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's the crazy part about it. Like you can, and like I'll give an example, like having multiple teams set up these like huge API endpoints. GraphQL pulls all those together. And like, for me, that's one of the massive parts about it. So like it's one of the massive game changers about it is just unifying tons of different APIs under one roof.
Great. So now that you're a developer advocate working at MongoDB, you're coming up on a year.
Yeah.
What kind of things are you developing? Are you actively using GraphQL, or is it mostly for examples and for? I know you do a ton of talks and a ton of social media, but
yeah, I'm actually in the process of converting over a project right now. So I'm working on a project. It's a Bechtel.io.
What's it called?
Bechtel.io. So it's a site that sucks up movie scripts and it tells it whether it passed the Bechtel test. And if you don't know what the Bechtel test is, it's a simple film test. It has to pass 3 rules. First is, does the film have 2 or more named female characters? That 2 have a conversation with each other. About 3, something that's not a man or men. And I'm using MongoDB to kind of store that data and then do some data analytics on those films too.
That's phenomenal. And so what do you do with that data? Is that, I guess I got to take a look at Bechtel.io.
Oh, yeah, totally. Actually, it's a collaborative project with my sister and I. So my sister is working on her PhD and she's using it for some of her research. So it's been a collaborative project with her and I have been working on the last couple of years. Like, for example, part of her research, she analyzed Oscar nominees and analyzing how friendly they are to women. And we can get a bunch of cool analytics on it too, like percentage of lines per female and male characters and female directors. We do a bunch of like gender analytics on film basically. But it's cool. Like, so before the only way to do that was by like watching a film, but now we're like massively analyzing massive bodies of work using this tool.
That's fantastic. Are you using MongoDB Atlas and GraphQL there?
Right, exactly. So we're using, right now I'm actually in the process of converting it over to use Graph or consuming GraphQL. So I'm using, the backend's built in Express and Node. The front end is built in React, and I'm using an Apollo wrapper to go and like get it. For anyone who's new out there to GraphQL, use Apollo. I tried teaching this just straight up vanilla GraphQL. It's a pain in the butt. Apollo wraps, it's agnostic about whatever framework you're using. You can use Vue, Angular, React, does not matter. And it makes it so much easier to like use data from a GraphQL endpoint. It's a piece of cake. Please check it out. You'll thank me later.
I actually have a question around this.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting again.
No.
But since I think a lot of our users are JavaScript developers,
Yeah.
why exactly would I want to use Apollo versus, say, just a JavaScript fetch or Axios or something similar with just the query inline?
Yes, absolutely. There is a bunch of reasons. Apollo, it does a bunch of stuff. Like it will, again, like set up polling. But the biggest thing is honestly just structuring the request to the backend. So what's awesome about Apollo is in graphical, I always start with graphical and I just write up my queries in there to make sure I got them correct. It's super easy to test it. The documentation's there. It'll like auto-correct it if I'm wrong. And I can just copy pasta that into my Apollo wrappers to go and make that in there. Before, when I was just using straight up fetch requests, I had to do some like weird parsing to get rid of all the extra spaces and make sure that my JSON's formatted correctly, which was like, it's a big pain in the butt.
Mm-hmm.
Apollo makes it super easy, basically, to just copy paste your request from graphical into your code base, and it just works. It does cool stuff too, like polling and caching requests that you like. I already got this thing; it'll cache it in memory, so you don't have to go back for it again. It's really smart about it, and there's a thriving ecosystem around it too.
Oh yeah, I've heard great things about Apollo. That's awesome. So, what apart from Bechtel.io do you want to talk about and tell the users? What else are you working on? Are you going to be in any shows, any speaking engagements coming up?
You know, we're filming this right around the time Corona's ramping up, so like our talks have been canceled like crazy. I will be working on some new video content though soon, and I do Twitch streaming every Friday with Nick actually at noon Central Time. But I've been going over some of our GraphQL content recently too. And since it's been so popular, we'll probably continue doing additional work on it too. I'll probably actually be doing some that work with Bechtel.io on that Twitch stream in the future.
That sounds great.
Awesome. So then, Joe, if any of the listeners wanted to get in touch with you, maybe learn a little bit more about what you're doing, do you have any recommendations? You want to send out any plugs?
Yeah, let's see here. Well, let's see here. If anyone has to like reach out or talk to me about GraphQL or JavaScripty stuff or whatever, I'd love to chat. Love it. Best way to get a hold of me is on Twitter, and my handle is Joe Karlsson, and the number one, that's JoeKarlsson, and the number one. And of course, we're on Twitch at MongoDB. But yeah, resources too. I have a bunch of code examples too that are fully documented for how to set this up. If someone's new to GraphQL, I recommend, can we talk a little bit like tips for learning a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I get asked a lot too about like best resources for using GraphQL. And there's a bunch, like the GraphQL website's amazing. There's a bunch of amazing blog posts. You can even type in like MongoDB and GraphQL, you'll find a million results. But I always recommend too, getting out there and trying it. Just build something. And to go one step further too, something I usually do when I'm picking up a new tech is I will get something working that someone else built, like a hello world or like a sample app. And then I start making changes to that app to basically fit whatever I'm doing too. So I'd actually recommend, I'm going to be sending these guys, maybe you can post it like in the notes for the show or whatever.
Absolutely.
But I'll give a little sample code base you can go check out too that will walk you through how to set it up. Yeah.
That'd be terrific. And I know that we've been talking very closely with Lauren Sands Ramshaw, who is the co-author with John Ressig on a great book called The GraphQL Guide. And he features some shout outs to MongoDB, some content around how to leverage MongoDB and GraphQL there. So you can get more information on that at GraphQL Guide. So GraphQL.guide.
I've heard amazing things about this book too. I haven't read it yet, but I got to check this thing out.
Yeah, it's available in beta, so you can check it out now. So that's it. So, hey, this has been a great, really quick half hour. It flew right by. I want to give you the opportunity to cover anything else that you think we might have missed or things that you want to tell users about GraphQL or about Joe Karlsson before we wrap things up.
Yeah, there's so much more we could talk about with GraphQL too. Like we didn't touch on like authentication or like like how we're actually doing those, designing a schema, or like, but there's so much other stuff you could do with it too. I hope this is just like a good introduction on it.
Yeah, this is definitely the goal. Again, as we mentioned on the outset, that we wanted folks to hear about GraphQL, understand a little bit more about what it is, why you might be interested, and then some resources on how to learn it. So I think we've covered all those bases. Nick, anything else before we close out?
No, I think it was great, and maybe we'll do a second episode where we do actually dive in deeper beyond just an introduction.
Yeah, I'd love to be back for that. That's awesome. Or someone else. Who knows? Inviting myself to the party again. What am I doing?
We love you.
Love to have
we
you.
Love you, Joe. Yeah. Hey, Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us on the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the MongoDB podcast. I want to give out a reminder that we do have MongoDB World coming up. And if you'd like to attend, we have a 25% discount for your pass. Go ahead and apply podcast when signing up for your pass. In addition, take a moment to follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, pretty much all of the social media networks. You can engage with us, ask us questions, and even submit feedback or suggestions for future episodes of the podcast. In addition, if you're listening to this episode or any other episode on Apple Podcasts or similar, some network that allows for ratings and reviews, it would mean a lot to us if you left it a 5-star rating and said something nice about the show, so that way future listeners can get an idea of what they're getting themselves into. We hope to see you on the next episode.